On a Tuesday morning in April of 1971, Roy Betancourt drove out to County Road J22 in Furnas County, Nebraska, and found that the bridge was gone. Not damaged, not weakened, gone. Willow Creek had risen 8 feet in 6 hours during the night. By the time he reached the site at dawn, there were 4 concrete footings, 40 feet of dark water moving fast, and a gap where a county road used to continue. He stood at the edge with his clipboard and his project folder and looked at the hole. Then he looked at his list. The list was the problem. Roy Betancourt had been Furnas County engineer for 19 years. He had a degree from the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, a working knowledge of every road and bridge in the county's 650 miles of maintained infrastructure, and a budget that never came close to covering what the county actually needed. The project queue was real. 98 bridges in Furnas County. Dozens of them needed repair or replacement. 3 had been flagged as structurally deficient. 2 were load posted, meaning heavy equipment had to find alternate routes that sometimes added 10 miles to a round trip. Every spring brought new flood damage. Every budget cycle brought the same conversation. Not enough money. Not enough manpower. Not enough time. The Willow Creek Bridge on J22 served 1 property. 1. Roy knew that before he reached for his calculator, but he ran the numbers anyway. A replacement bridge, concrete and steel, single lane, meeting current Nebraska Department of Roads standards, would cost $48,000. That was the estimate for a structure that would last 60 years without major maintenance. It was a reasonable number. It was also more than the county's entire bridge repair allocation for the next 2 years combined. On the first day after the flood, Roy made the calls. He contacted the state for emergency bridge funding. The answer was no. The program was for structures serving multiple properties, and the J22 bridge served 1 farm. On the second day, he requested reclassification. If the bridge could be designated a county arterial, it might qualify for different funding. The roads department said the traffic count didn't support it. 1 farm, 1 landowner, 1 set of tire tracks in the mud. On the third day, Roy put the J22 bridge at the bottom of the project list, below 11 other structures that served more properties, carried more traffic, and had stronger arguments for priority funding. Based on available resources, he estimated 5 years before Furnas County could rebuild the Willow Creek crossing. He drove the alternate route himself that Wednesday morning to understand what he was asking Harlan Voss to accept. 19 miles on gravel roads that were already soft from the spring melt. He watched the mud build up on his county truck's wheel wells. He thought about doing that twice a day, every day, through June, through harvest, through the freeze-up in November when the ruts hardened like concrete and every mile rattled the frame. He thought about cattle that needed feed hauled in, about grain that needed to reach the elevator before prices shifted, about a school bus that wouldn't run a 19-mile detour for 1 kid. He filed his report. 5 years, if they were lucky. He wrote it in the passive voice, the way engineers write things they don't want to have to say out loud. 2 days later, Harlan Voss walked into the Board of Supervisors meeting. That's when the mud-caked work boots appeared at the door of the second-floor meeting room in the Furnas County Courthouse. Let me tell you about Harlan Voss. because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. Harlan was 47 years old in the spring of 1971. He had farmed 310 acres in the Willow Creek bottomland since 1950, when his father handed in the deed and moved into a rented room in Beaver City. Harlan had been 26 then, newly discharged from 3 years in the Army, newly married to Ruth Paulson from the next township over, newly responsible for ground that had been in the Voss family since 1903. He was not a man who complained. That was the first thing neighbors said about him, and they said it the way people describe a characteristic they've tested a few times and found to be genuine. Harlan Voss did not complain. He also did not explain himself much, did not seek advice unless he'd already decided to take it, and did not raise his voice in any conversation that anyone in Furnas County could recall. He walked into the meeting still wearing his field jacket. There was creek mud on his boots from that morning when he'd stood at the east bank and measured the gap with his eyes the way a carpenter measures a board. Not guessing, not estimating, actually looking. He didn't sit down. "Mornin'," he said. "The bridge on J22 is gone. Flood took it. When can you rebuild it?" Roy Betancourt looked up from his folder. The room got quiet in a particular way. The way rooms get quiet when someone asks a question and everyone already knows the answer is going to be bad. Let me tell you about Harlan's welding, because it's the real heart of this story. Not the bridge, the man who built it. And to understand the man, you have to understand what his hands could do. Harlan's father, Otto Voss, had learned to arc weld in 1934, the same year the Dust Bowl's worst storms buried Kansas and Nebraska under walls of moving soil. He learned because the farm couldn't afford to replace broken parts. It could only afford to fix them. He taught Harlan at 13, the same way he taught him to drive a tractor and read a rain gauge, by putting him in front of it and correcting his mistakes until there weren't any more mistakes to correct. By the time Harlan came home from the Army in 1950, he had 3 years of military welding experience stacked on top of his father's lessons. The Army had taught him MIG and TIG and oxyacetylene cutting. It had taught him to weld in bad light, in cold weather, on damaged equipment that needed to work again in 4 hours. It had taught him that a weld is not decoration. It is a decision about where a part will and will not break. A good weld means the metal fails somewhere else. A bad weld means it fails right there, usually at the worst possible moment. Harlan Voss did not make bad welds. Over 21 years of farming the Willow Creek bottomland, he had welded everything that could be welded, and some things that probably couldn't. A cracked drawbar on a disc harrow that a dealer said needed to be replaced. A split auger housing on a grain bin that a parts distributor in Holdridge said was discontinued. A hay mower sickle bar that had come apart at 4 separate joints and the 2 different neighbors had already declared dead. Harlan welded it. It ran another 9 years. His barn was a working record of what one man with a welder and a problem could accomplish. The walls held brackets and mounts and repairs going back to 1950. Some of the early work was rough, the technique of a young man still learning. But the later work was precise in the way that only comes from 20 years of doing the same thing correctly. Deep penetration, consistent bead, no porosity. Metal joined to metal so thoroughly that the union was stronger than either piece alone. Neighbors didn't joke about it the way neighbors joke about things they find harmless. They talked about it the way people talk about something they've actually needed. "Before you call the dealer," was how the sentence started, "have you asked Harlan?" Ruth Voss said the welding was what made her say yes when Harlan proposed in the spring of 1950. She didn't mean the welding literally. She meant what the welding represented: a man who looked at a broken thing and thought about how to fix it, not about what it would cost to replace it. A man with that orientation, she told her sister, was a man worth building a life with. Harlan was not thinking about any of this when Roy Betancourt told him 5 years. He was thinking about 40 feet of open water and what it would take to close it. He already had an answer. He'd had it since he stood at the creek bank that morning and measured the gap with his eyes. He just needed to find out what Roy Betancourt was going to say first. "I'll build it myself," Harlan said. The sentence landed in the meeting room the way a dropped tool lands on a concrete floor. Not loud, but impossible to ignore. Roy Betancourt set down his pencil. The 3 supervisors, Orville Kempf, who farmed 450 acres east of Cambridge, Leonard Foss, a retired feed dealer turned county official, and Dale Osterhaus, who ran a hog operation south of Beaver City, exchanged the kind of look that people exchange when they're deciding whether to take something seriously. Roy took it seriously enough to answer. He was a careful man, and a thorough one, and he gave Harlan the full professional response: load calculations, engineering drawings, state certification requirements, county liability. The difference between a man who knows how to weld and a licensed structural engineer. He said it without contempt. He said it the way a doctor tells a patient why they can't perform their own surgery. Not unkindly, but with the firm confidence of someone who has a degree on their wall and considers that degree relevant to the conversation. "Harlan," Roy said, and there was something in the way he said the name that the room noticed. A slight softening, the tone of a man being patient with someone who doesn't quite understand. A bridge isn't a fence. You can't just torch some scrap metal together and drive a grain truck across it. The phrase went around Beaver City inside of a week. Torch some scrap metal together. It attached itself to Harlan the way phrases do in small counties. Not because anyone meant it cruelly, but because it was vivid, and vivid things stick. At the elevator on Friday, someone asked Harlan how the scrap metal bridge was coming. At the co-op on Saturday, Walt Detmer, who farmed the quarter section north of the Voss place and was about the closest thing Harlan had to a best friend, told him the supervisors had been talking. Leonard Foss had apparently said that Harlan Voss building a bridge was like a man with a pocket knife trying to do appendix surgery. Every conversation about it had the same shape: gentle amusement at the front end, a small pause, and then a slightly more serious question underneath. Could he actually do it? Nobody said it directly, but nobody said he couldn't either. At least, not to his face. Harlan Voss didn't respond to any of it. He drove home from the co-op, changed into his work clothes, and went to the university library in Lincoln. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever looked at a problem that everyone around you said was unsolvable and felt quietly and without drama that you already knew how to solve it? Have you ever sat in a room full of people explaining why something couldn't be done and realized, while they were still talking, that they were working from a set of assumptions you didn't share? Have you ever had a skill, something built over years, something ordinary to you because you'd done it so many times, that turned out to be exactly the thing the situation required? Most people have. The difference is what they do with it. Some people wait for permission. Some people wait for an expert to confirm what they already know. Some people wait for the right moment, the right conditions, the right set of approvals. Harlan Voss had that certainty as he pulled out of the Furnas County Library parking lot in Lincoln with a photocopied page from a 1958 Army Corps of Engineers field manual folded in his jacket pocket. He drove 180 miles back to Furnas County. He stopped once for gas and a cup of coffee. He didn't stop to reconsider. 3 days after the supervisors' meeting, Harlan stopped by Walt Detmer's place and spread a hand-drawn diagram on the hood of Walt's truck. "Railroad rail," Harlan said. Walt looked at the diagram. "For the bridge?" "For the beams. 8 sections across the gap, 30 feet each. That gives me a 6-foot overlap on each bank." Walt looked at the diagram for a while. "Rail is heavy." "Rail is rated for 300,000 pounds per section under rolling load. I've got 8 of them. The Army Corps of Engineers publishes a field manual for building emergency military bridges. There's a table in Chapter 4. 40-foot span, 60-ton load capacity. 8 rail sections. I've got a 38-foot gap." Walt looked at the gap numbers. "Where are you getting rail?" "CB&Q pulled a branch line out of the county in '66. 4 miles of track sitting in a field south of Cambridge. I called the salvage company in Omaha yesterday. $12 a section." Walt did the arithmetic. $240 for the beams? $240. Let me explain what railroad rail actually is, because it's the foundation of what Harlan understood and Roy Betancourt didn't. A rail section is not a bar of steel. It's an engineered shape, a vertical web with a wide, flat head at the top and a broad, flat base at the bottom. Engineers call this an I-beam profile, and they call it that because the cross-section looks like the letter I. The wide surfaces resist bending. The vertical web resists shear. The whole shape is designed to carry enormous loads across spans without deflecting, without cracking, and without fatiguing. Because a railroad rail doesn't carry one heavy load, it carries an endless series of heavy loads, day after day, for decades. The rail sections sitting in that field south of Cambridge had been built for exactly that purpose. They were rated for freight trains. They were rated for coal cars and grain cars, and the full weight of a loaded locomotive rolling over them at 40 miles an hour. Harlan was asking them to hold still and carry a grain truck. "The thing people don't understand about old materials," Harlan told Walt, "is that they weren't old when they were made. They were made to a spec. The spec doesn't expire." He tapped the diagram. "Roy said I can't weld some scrap metal together and call it a bridge. He's right. You can't. But this isn't scrap metal. This is engineered structural steel in a load-rated I-beam configuration. The fact that it used to be a railroad doesn't make it weaker. It makes it proven." Walt studied the diagram for another minute. Then he said, "When do you start?" "Monday," Harlan said. "I could use a second set of hands for the last few weeks." Walt Detmer didn't farm anywhere near Willow Creek. He had no stake in whether the bridge got built. He said yes anyway, which is its own kind of answer about what kind of neighbor he was. Harlan drove home and wrote out his materials list. Railroad rail, $240. Concrete for bearing pads, $195. Oak decking from the sawmill in Cambridge, $165. Bolts, welding rod, grinding discs, $85. Paint, $38. Rented concrete mixer, $30. He added the column twice to make sure. $753. Let me tell you about the construction. because that's when the real show began. Harlan started on April 16th, 1 week after the flood. The first thing anyone noticed, anyone who drove past on the county road, which was not many people on a gravel stretch serving one farm, was the sound. Arc welding at night carries across flat ground. The crack and hiss of the electrode, the short, sharp pops when the arc breaks, the deeper hum when it holds. Harlan worked until dark every day and sometimes past it, and the sound drifted east across the fields toward the township road. Lila Detmer, Walt's wife, told a friend at the elevator that it sounded like something being assembled. Not repaired, assembled. Like the noise had a direction to it. The rail sections came first. Harlan had borrowed a hydraulic loader attachment from Orville Kempf and spent a day placing the 8 beams across the gap, 2 feet apart, each one resting on a freshly poured concrete bearing pad set into the old 1943 footings. The rails were 30 feet long and the gap was 38 feet. He'd accounted for that in the diagram. A 6-foot bearing on each bank, the rail resting solidly on concrete on both sides before it crossed open water. When all 8 were in position, the structure looked like a cattle grid scaled up for trucks. From the road, it looked provisional. It looked like the kind of thing you'd expect a farmer to put together with what he had available. It did not look like a bridge. Not yet. Then, Harlan started welding the cross members. He worked from the center outward, every 4 feet, short sections of rail cut to width and welded flat across the tops of the main beams. Then the diagonal bracing, longer pieces running corner to corner between adjacent beams, tied into the web of each rail with full penetration joints. The welder cracked and hissed. The blue-gray beads built up. The 8 separate rails began to become one thing. Walt Detmer drove out the second week and stood on the east bank watching for a while before he put on his gloves and started helping with the decking. "It doesn't look like a bridge," he said. "Not yet," Harlan said from underneath, where he was checking the undersides of the cross welds. "Roy Betancourt drove by yesterday," Walt said. "Slowed down. Didn't stop." Harlan didn't respond. He moved the welding lead to the next joint. 2 farm families from the North Road stopped over the course of construction, pulled their trucks onto the grass verge, and watched for a while without getting out. One of them, a woman named Irene Schreiber, whose husband hauled grain to the same elevator as Harlan, told her husband that evening it didn't look the way she'd expected. She'd expected something rough and clearly temporary. She said it was actually starting to look like a real thing. Her husband drove by himself the next day. He watched Harlan lay the oak decking, 2-inch boards, 12 inches wide, bolted through pre-drilled holes, and thought about what it would cost him to do something equivalent. He went home and didn't say anything about it to anyone, but he thought about it for several days. The structure went gray when Harlan painted it. 2 coats of rust-inhibiting primer, brushed on with a 4-inch brush over 2 long afternoons. Gray, not pretty, not trying to be pretty. Functional in the way that tools are functional. Every feature there because it had to be. Nothing there because it looked good. On May 24th, 38 days after he started, Harlan Voss set down his brush and looked at what he'd built. He called Roy Betancourt that evening. "The bridge is done," Harlan said. "I'd like you to come inspect it." There was a pause on the line. Then Roy said, "I'll come Thursday." Roy Betancourt drove out to County Road J22 on a Thursday morning in early June. He had told his assistant before he left that he expected to spend an hour writing up a list of structural deficiencies. He brought his clipboard, his load tables, and a camera for the report. He pulled onto the grass at the east bank and stopped the truck. He sat in the cab for a moment before he got out. This was not something Roy Betancourt normally did. He was a man who moved efficiently from his vehicle to the site, assessed what needed assessing, and got back in. He sat in the cab because the thing on the other side of the windshield was not what he had mentally prepared himself to see. He got out. He walked to the edge of the bank. The bridge was gray. Gray from the primer, gray from the rail steel underneath, and it was genuinely ugly in the way that purely functional things are sometimes ugly. There was no aesthetic consideration in it. Every element was there because it had to be there, and that was the end of the design conversation. But it was straight, and it was level, and it was, visibly, solid. Roy looked at the structure for a long time before he stepped onto it. Then he stepped onto it. "You used railroad rail," he said, not as an accusation, just as an observation. He was looking at the cross-section of the beams where they extended past the guardrail on the upstream side. Harlan, standing on the west bank with his arms crossed, said, "I did." Roy looked at him. The smile he'd had in the meeting room in April, the patient, professional smile of a man explaining something obvious to someone who doesn't quite understand, was not on his face. His face was doing something more careful than that. "Drive it," Harlan said. "I'll get the truck." Let me tell you about what happened next, because this is the part the numbers don't fully capture. Harlan walked to the west side of the bridge, climbed into his grain truck, a 1964 International loaded with 4,000 pounds of old fencing material he'd used for ballast, and started the engine. The truck was not loaded to capacity. It was loaded to roughly the weight of a moderately full harvest load. A test, not a stunt. Roy Betancourt was standing on the east bank. He had his clipboard. He had not opened it. Harlan put the truck in gear and moved it onto the bridge at walking speed. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. The truck was on the bridge. The bridge was over the creek. The creek was moving underneath. And for the span of 2 or 3 seconds that felt longer than they were, everything simply held in the same position it had been in. Then Harlan drove to the center of the span. The full weight of the truck was now on the unsupported section, 38 feet of open water below the frame. Roy Betancourt, watching from the east bank, later said he found himself looking at the water instead of the bridge. Not because he expected the bridge to fail, but because some part of him wanted to confirm that the water was still there, that the situation was real, that this was actually happening. The deflection at midspan was 1/4 of an inch. Roy measured it with his gauge after Harlan pulled the truck onto the east bank and got out. 1/4 inch under 34,000 pounds across a 38-foot span. The Nebraska standard for acceptable deflection was 3/8 of an inch. Harlan's bridge was 40% stiffer than it needed to be for a load nearly double what he'd told the supervisors he'd designed for. Roy wrote the number on his clipboard. He wrote it, and then he looked at it. Then he climbed down the bank and looked at the underside of the bridge from the water's edge. The welds were not decorative. Harlan had not made art. What he had made were full-penetration structural joints, the kind of weld where the electrode melts completely through the base metal and fuses with the piece underneath, creating a connection that is stronger in shear than either of the pieces it connects. Roy Betancourt had evaluated enough bridge structures in 19 years to know what a proper structural weld looked like. He also knew what a farmer with a stick welder making his best guess looked like. These were not his best guesses. These were correct. The cross-bracing was at consistent intervals. The diagonal members ran at the right angles. The bearing pads were centered on the footings and flat. The decking was bolted, not spiked. Carriage bolts through pre-drilled holes, not nails driven at an angle and hoping for the best. Roy climbed back up the bank. Harlan was leaning against the truck. He was not watching Roy. He was looking at the creek, the way a person looks at something they've been looking at for 38 days and have some right to look at. "It's overbuilt," Roy said. "I know," Harlan said. "3 times the steel you need for this span and this load class." "I know." Roy looked at his clipboard. He looked at the bridge. He looked at Harlan. What Roy Betancourt was experiencing in that moment was a specific kind of professional discomfort. The discomfort of a credentialed expert standing next to evidence that someone without credentials had done the technical work correctly. Not adequately, correctly. In some respects, better than correctly. "Off the record," Roy said. "Off the record. The structure is sound, the welds are sound, the design logic is sound. I wouldn't have used rail, but the load table in the Army Corps manual is legitimate, and your span-to-section ratio is inside the parameters." He paused. "The open grid deck is actually an improvement over what was there before. The old timber structure caught floodwater like a wall. Your design lets it pass through." Harlan looked at him. "Is that in the report?" "The report will say this is a private structure on private land adjacent to a county right-of-way, and that the county neither approves nor disapproves its use." Roy closed the clipboard. "That's the most I can do officially." "That's enough," Harlan said. Roy Betancourt stood on the east bank for another minute. The creek moved underneath the gray steel. The beams held it apart from the road on each side without effort, without drama, without any visible sign that holding 40 feet of open span required anything from them at all. "You overbuilt it on purpose," Roy said. It wasn't a question. "I wanted it to be the kind of thing where nobody could look at it and find a reason to take it down," Harlan said. "Including you." Roy almost smiled. He didn't quite get there. He got in his county truck and drove back to Beaver City. Harlan drove his grain truck across his bridge 4 more times that afternoon. Not because he needed to test it further, because it was his, and he could. And for 38 days it hadn't been. It had been a project, a problem, a gap that needed closing. And now it was simply a bridge, and the creek was simply something you drove across. Let me tell you about what followed, because the numbers are the proof that the meeting room was wrong. Harlan Voss built his bridge for $753. The county's estimate for a replacement structure had been $48,000. Harlan's bridge cost 1.5 cents on the dollar of what the county said the job required. The Willow Creek Bridge on J22 passed its first flood test in October of 1971, 5 months after completion. The creek came up 4 feet in 2 days. The water reached the underside of the deck on the upstream side and cleared the deck by 8 inches on the downstream side, where the grade was slightly lower. The open grid rail structure, the design Roy had called improvised, the design no manual had specified, let the water move through the span rather than building against it. The old timber bridge had failed because its solid plank deck caught floodwater like a dam. Harlan's bridge offered the water nowhere to push. It held. In 1977, Willow Creek flooded again, worse than 71. Harlan went out with a logging chain and his tractor and pulled debris from the upstream face before it could accumulate into a secondary dam. The bridge held. In 1980, he replaced 5 deck planks that had split from freeze-thaw cycling. $18 in oak from Cambridge. He repainted the rail in 1982. The original welds showed no cracking and no subsurface corrosion. In 1983, Craig Schuster, the new county engineer, 33 years old, freshly arrived from a master's program at the University of Nebraska, drove out to J22 because the supervisors had asked him to look at the Farmer Bridge. He brought a deflection gauge. He ran a county truck loaded to 37,000 pounds across the span and measured 1/16 of an inch of mid-span deflection. The allowable undercurrent standards was a 1/4 inch. Craig Schuster climbed under the bridge, looked at the welds, looked at the cross bracing, looks at the bearing pads, and wrote a memo to the supervisors that said Harlan Voss had built the most structurally over-engineered single-lane bridge in Furnas County, and that it outperformed at least 12 county-owned structures that had been designed by licensed engineers. The county formally accepted the bridge in February of 1984, 13 years after Roy said it couldn't be done. In 2011, floods damaged or destroyed 9 county bridges in Furnas County. Willow Creek set a 50-year record. The water rose to within 5 inches of the deck, the highest it had ever reached. The open grid design held. 9 county bridges required emergency repair or replacement. The Willow Creek Bridge on J22 required nothing. Roy Betancourt retired in 1981. He drove back to the bridge in the summer of 1982 and walked across it alone. Then he drove to Harlan's farm. Harlan was in the barn sharpening equipment. Roy told him the bridge was good work and that he'd been wrong to dismiss it the way he had. Harlan told him the dismissal was what made him overbuild it, and that the overbuild was why it was going to outlast both of them. Roy came back every summer after that and walked the bridge. He checked the welds the way engineers check things, not because he expected to find a problem, but because checking was how he knew something was still right. He died in 1993. Harlan carried his casket. Harlan's granddaughter, Nora Voss, is studying civil engineering at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Her senior thesis examines the structural principles in the J22 bridge. Her faculty advisor drove to Furnas County to see it. He stood on the deck for 20 minutes and said nothing. Then he said, "Your grandfather didn't build this with engineering knowledge. He built it with engineering instinct. In 50 years of teaching, I've rarely seen a cleaner example of a man understanding a problem at the level that matters." The Willow Creek Bridge is 53 years old. It has never failed. It cost $753. This story draws from real rural infrastructure history in the Great Plains, the bridge-building traditions of farm families who maintained their own access to land when county resources couldn't reach them. Characters and specific dialogue are dramatized for storytelling. Did your family ever build, fix, or maintain something the county or a government agency said wasn't possible, or told you to wait years for? A road, a barn, a waterway, a fence line? Tell us in the comments.